In the early 1980s, when graffiti seemed to be everywhere, hundreds of startling black-painted silhouettes appeared mysteriously on buildings on the Lower East Side and in other parts of Manhattan. The spectral, life-size, menacing figures lurked and skulked and leapt. Some of their heads, with paint splattered upward, seemed to be exploding. Richard Hambleton, the Canadian-born conceptual artist who painted them all sometimes after fleeing the police, paint bucket in hand, was known as the shadowman. "I painted the town black," Mr. Hambleton told People magazine in 1984. "They could represent watchmen, a danger, or the shadows of a human body after a nuclear holocaust, or even my own shadow." He became part of the downtown art scene with his contemporaries Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat at Club 57, a basement bar on St. Mark's Place in the East Village that is the subject of a new exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, complete with one of Mr. Hambleton's shadowman works. He also put his shadowman images on canvas and paper, and for a time they fueled a lucrative business and gave him international recognition. While in Europe for exhibitions of his work, he painted his shadow men on Venice walls and the Berlin Wall. But for the rest of his life he battled drug addictions, mostly to heroin, and occasional evictions from his apartments and studios. He was forgotten for a while but later rediscovered. At one point he abruptly switched to painting seascapes and colorful landscapes, before eventually returning in earnest to his shadowy figures, knowing they were his most valuable currency for survival, even as barter for a meal when he was at his most downtrodden. Mr. Hambleton died on Sunday at 65. Kristen Woodward, co-owner of the Woodward Gallery in Manhattan, which worked with him, said he died in a downtown Manhattan apartment with a female friend. She said she did not know any other circumstances or the cause. He had skin cancer and the spinal conditions scoliosis and kyphosis. Richard Hambleton's mysterious figures, like this one on a Lower East Side corner, could represent watchmen, a danger, or the shadows of a human body after a nuclear holocaust, or even my own shadow, he said in 1984. Hank O'Neill, with her husband, John Woodward, Ms. Woodward, exhibited Mr. Hambleton's art, found studios and lodging for him and cooked for him. A trained nurse, she also attended to many of his medical needs. "He was so charismatic and so manipulative, but once you were in his sphere you couldn't shake him," Ms. Woodward said in an interview. "He had it. He didn't care about the periphery. He would live in a bag on the street. All he wanted was paint supplies. A prankster who liked to provoke, as the anonymous street artist Banksy has done since the 1990s. Mr. Hambleton came to public attention in the mid to late 1970s by painting faux crime scene outlines of bodies on pavement and adding blood, hoping to make people believe that a serial murderer was on the loose. He began this image mass murder series in his hometown, Vancouver, British Columbia, and then took it down the West Coast and across North America. He carried squeeze bottles filled with white paint for the outline and red paint for the make-believe blood. "I remember the stumbling on one of them and thinking it was a real crime scene," Penny Arcade, the performance artist, says in Shadowman, a forthcoming documentary about Mr. Hambleton, directed by Oren Jacobi. After seeing another outline, she says, "She realized that this may be something else, but I didn't have any language for it." Shadowman exclusive clip video by IndieWire. Mr. Hambleton studied maps to determine where, in each city, he would strike next. "I began to think I was murdering people, going back to my hotel covered in paint, blooded paint," he says in the documentary, adding, "Blood has a beautiful color." Mr. Hambleton in Los Angeles in 1980 near one of his spectral, life-size figures. Ben Buchanan announcing that Dick Tracy, also known as Richard Hambleton, was the private detective trying to solve the murders in Vancouver. He posted 4,000 fake wanted posters seeking the apprehension of Mr. REE for the crimes. In 1980, soon after moving to the Lower East Side, he started another urban art project, installing full-size photographic images of himself, dressed up in a suit and tie and staring, on walls around the city and elsewhere. He called it "I Only Have Eyes for You." The images were printed on paper that stretched when moistened and faded to white shadows after 3 months. His early shadowman period led to shadow images of bucking horses and riders on walls and canvases. By 1984, he had turned to the Marlboro Man, the cowboy figure whose macho image promoted cigarettes for decades. Mr. Hambleton, who smoked, toyed with the image, painting shadow figures over it, sometimes mixing tobacco with black paint for what he called a black lung effect. Richard Art Hambleton was born in Vancouver on June 23, 1952. His parents, Arthur and Vale Hambleton, survive him, as do 2 sisters and a brother. Mr. Hambleton's Fountain of Youth 1982, an oil painting. Woodward Gallery. After graduating from the Emily Carr University of Art Design in Vancouver, he started the Pumps Center for Alternative Art, a gallery, performance and video space, in the same city. By the mid-1980s he had begun his transition to creating enormous seascapes, among them turbulent ocean wave paintings. "I wanted to do something that was a different sensibility," he says in the documentary. It's about love. Reviewing an exhibition of Mr. Hambleton's paintings at the Piezoelectric Gallery in the East Village in 1985, Michael Brentson of the New York Times wrote that the violence inherent in his early shadowman work had not fully left him. There are 3 paintings called Rainstorm, in which raging water seems to be rushing toward us from within the canvas, Mr. Brentson wrote. In each of the paintings, sea and sky rage a bit more until they seem on the point of swallowing everything. Mr. Hambleton soon moved into his beautiful period, painting landscapes with gold and silver leaf and tinted varnishes. Mr. Hambleton in 1984. He was so charismatic and so manipulative, but once you were in his sphere you couldn't shake him, Petrellery owner said. Fran van der Herven. Woodward Gallery archives. But by the early 1990s he had begun to withdraw from the art scene. Mr. Herring had died of AIDS at 31, Mr. Basquiat of a drug overdose at 27, and Mr. Hambleton, as Woodward said, had become paranoid about gallery culture and the impact on the artist and his freedoms. His life had begun to unravel. His drug use continued. His skin cancer worsened. He lived in increasing squalor. His goal was to reach the sublime, as Woodward said. He used drugs to get there. It was just who he was. In 2009, 2 art entrepreneurs cajoled him into producing some new work, paintings of shadowy figures wearing suits, which were added to a retrospective exhibition in New York sponsored by Giorgio Armani. For his documentary, Mr. Jacoby filmed Mr. Hambleton as he procrastinated and battled with his anxious patrons. The show, which traveled to Europe the next year, was successful, and a comeback seemed possible. But the moment did not last long. While Mr. Hambleton kept painting almost until he died, he was becoming increasingly frail. His cancer was eroding his face. His back was bowed and lopsided from his spinal conditions. He used his folding bicycle as a walker. At times he was homeless. At least Basquiat, died, he says bitingly in the documentary, during a scene shot in 2014. "I was alive when I died, That's the problem." A version of this article appears in print on November 4, 2017, on page D6 of the New York edition with the headline "Richard Hambleton, 65, conceptual artist known as Shadowman, is dead."